We're back. By the way, Alex Hunter, the DA in the question, said this morning on the Today Show that he had a 4-minute conversation with you. When was that?
I believe that was his first press conference.
You were there, or he spoke to you before it?
I was not at the press conference. I was in a conference room listening to the press conference and was so moved by his determination to find the killer of my daughter.
As you've just heard, Patsy first encountered DA Alex Hunter at a press conference, and then she adds, and remember this is in the context of it's the year 2000, March 2000, and Hunter has given them, the Ramseys, a get-out-of-jail-free card. And then Patsy says the following.
I asked my lawyer, who was there with me, I said, can we get him on the telephone? And he looked at me and said, what do you want to say to him? And I said, I want to speak with that man. Please get him on the telephone. And I said, thank you. As a mother of a murdered child, thank you for your willingness. I mean, he looked at that camera and said, we will find you. We will find you.
You like him?
I like the fact that he's determined to find out who did this, and he wasn't going to rubber stamp the police decision, that it was John and was me.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, it's been a while since we did these 5 slips from the Larry King interview, and we are going to be resuming it. Bear in mind, about a week from now, the special appears on Netflix. Now, take a look at this. As Patsy's talking about Hunter not rubber stamping, those are her words. Patsy saying Hunter's not rubber stamping. And again, remember this is the year 2000. It's March 2000. It's months after the grand jury apparently didn't vote to indict the Ramseys, right? And Patsy's on CNN saying that Hunter wouldn't rubber stamp the police decision. And at that moment, look carefully, Patsy turns around to face John mid-sentence. It's almost like John has kicked Patsy's foot under the table. And if you play this over and over again, the camera is quite zoomed in, but you almost hear kind of a scuffle. And I mean, it is a very sensitive subject matter. And maybe John was worried that Patsy was going to give the game away. Let's watch that again.
We will find you.
You like him?
I like the fact that he's determined to find out who did this, and he wasn't going to rubber stamp the police decision, that it was John and was me.
Now, earlier, Patsy talks about what she liked about him was his willingness to, fill in the blank, because for me, the strange thing in retrospect doesn't seem to be D.A. Hunter's willingness, it seemed to be his lack of willingness. You might say, okay, well, with regard to what? Well, look where the case is today. Was that due to willingness or lack of willingness in terms of prosecuting the Ramseys? Or just prosecuting this case? And now for a third time, let's go back to that. Patsy saying, I like the fact that he's determined. And at this point, she's actually shaking her head no. Because he wasn't very determined to take any case to court, let alone this one. Right? And she's saying, I like the fact that he's determined to find out who did this. Really, was he determined? Was he really determined to find out who did this? And she goes on to say, and he wasn't going to rubber stamp. And then there's a muffled noise that's heard, which seems to cause Patsy to spin towards John. She really does turn abruptly. And then she says, the police decision, and when she says that, she looks directly at John. And then she says, you know that it was John and it was me. And at this point, if you look quite carefully, she seems to be hiding a smile. It's really something you could really watch over and over again and just see all sorts of layers of micro expressions, right? And Patsy's lip actually curls slightly, and she seems to press her lips together and almost sucked them in to prevent herself from smiling. Let's watch that clip again in slow motion and watch out for any micro expressions from Patsy. Now, Hunter said, "We will find you." That's the way Patsy puts it. It's actually Patsy who said, "We will find you." I think he said something along the lines of, "Soon there will be no one on the list but you," right? But Hunter never did. He never did find the perpetrator. And yet Patsy is so effusive here in her gratitude to Hunter. Think about it. It's March 2000. And Patsy is sort of grateful. It's like, wow, I'm so grateful that we are where we are right now with this case. And I can't help wondering what Patsy was really thanking the DA for. Because what the DA ended up doing was not signing off on those 4 indictments. And that definitely did help Patsy and John. The question is, did they know he'd helped them then? Before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you are looking out for the documentary, it's a 3-parter coming out on Netflix, I think on the 27th, so in about a week from now. I beg your pardon, the 25th, then you're probably going to want to watch this channel just for our analysis of the docuseries. If in the meantime, if you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So we passed the 20-minute mark of the first interview with Larry King, basically halfway. And so in this analysis, let's look at 5 more possible slip-ups that occurred during that interview. Number 1, why did you need a lawyer? Great question from Larry. I must say this is such an excellent interview from Larry. He was very clued up on what to ask.
The thing that hurt you, John, I mean, press-wise, lawyers, PR people. Why? Why'd you need a lawyer?
Now, when you watch this in real time, it's easy to miss the nuances, so we're going to slow it down. Larry asks, that was another thing that hurt you, John. Why did you need a lawyer? And look at what happens. John looks down, and for a good long while, he's unable to formulate an answer. He sort of makes this weird, response. Let's watch his reaction in slow motion again. And now let's listen to it.
We didn't bring in lawyers. A good friend of mine who was at our home.
Now, I've purposely cut him off. He basically is asked, why did you need a lawyer? And he answers after this response, we didn't bring in lawyers. And then some storytelling follows. Now, Detective Arndt's report is a little different. It shows when the police arrived at the furnace to talk to the Ramseys. This was on December 26th. This was hours after JONBENET had been found, right? The Ramseys once again had a small group of individuals shielding them. This time a doctor who said that Patsy was too medicated to talk, and not one, but actually 2 attorneys. We're going to deal with Arndt's written report in a second. But Arndt is clear that within 8 hours of her seeing JONBENET dead, John already had a lawyer at his side. That's pretty fast work. And she clarified this in a report that he was indeed providing John with advice. Not just that he had a lawyer at his side, he was actually, and this is mentioned in a report, explicitly providing him with advice. Let's read the report. At approximately 21:30 hours, this is December 26th, Detective Sergeant Larry Mason, he was later kicked off the investigation, and I met with John Ramsey at the, I think it's Fernie residence. Sergeant Mason and I met with John Ramsey in an office area room located in the basement of the, I think, Fernie residence. Other persons present in this room included John Ramsey's brother, Jeff Ramsey, and then Blank, who introduced himself as an attorney and a stockbroker with Blank, located in Atlanta, Georgia. Doctor, I think that's Dr. Booth, the physician for the Ramsey family, that's quite interesting, and Mike Bynum, who described himself as a friend of John Ramsey and also as an attorney who was providing John Ramsey with advice. Now, I think that other name that's blanked out, and it's quite a long name, might be Ron Westmoreland. He's mentioned in John Ramsey's book. And it's really interesting that it's not only an attorney, but a stockbroker that's there as well. And obviously that is dealing with John's finances, I guess. And think about that, talking about the financial situation of this wealthy individual 8 hours after JONBENET died. And then Arndt goes on to write, Mike Bynum described himself as a friend of John Ramsey, but also as an attorney, this is important, who was providing John Ramsey with advice. Sergeant Mason and I met with John Ramsey for about 40 minutes. The following information was learned from this meeting. I asked to speak with Patsy Ramsey. I was told by Dr. Buffe that Patsy Ramsey was too medicated to talk to anyone. Dr. Buffe had given Patsy Valium. So can you see suddenly now that the police kind of know what's going on, know what the real situation is, now suddenly they can't talk to Patsy. I mean, the cops, actually what was going on here was the cops wanted to set a date for formal interviews, but guess what? They met with resistance, with John, per Arndt's report, saying that this was a bad time of the year for him, as his other daughter Beth had died in early January. The report goes on to note, Sergeant Mason had told John it would be helpful to their investigation if they could interview him and Patsy as soon as possible. Sergeant Mason requested that they interview John and Patsy on Saturday morning, December 28th. So it wouldn't have been the next day, but the day after. Dr. Buffe told Sergeant Mason he didn't know if Patsy would be available for an interview at that time. So even Dr. Buffe saying, well, I've medicated Patsy. I don't think she's going to be ready by the 28th either. Dr. Buffe said that Patsy was in a fragile emotional state and he did not want to subject her to anything which would further upset her. No definite answer was given regarding the request to interview John. Now, do you notice
Take a deep breath. Patsy?
Do you notice how the hurry of Patsy's desperate 911 call, supposedly involving a kidnapper, is now, right? How many hours later? 16 hours later, that hurry is replaced with delay. And beyond that, entropy. When it turns out there isn't a kidnapper, entropy, and that will go on until the end of April the following year. So now let me ask you, if there was a kidnapper, why were the Ramseys suddenly out of it, not only the night of December 26th, but for the next 4 months? And now suddenly, oh no, we do want to find the kidnapper again. Don't you want to catch the killer of your child? The answer seems to be an obvious yes, but could it be less obvious? If you ask the question, don't you want to catch the killer of your child? Could there be a less obvious answer? Could it be no? And how could it be no? Number 2, at the time we said, what do we need lawyers for? John in the year 2000 seems naively unaware of the legal quagmire he was in, and despite being an entrepreneur of the year, a savvy businessman, apparently he needs others to explain why he needs lawyers.
I said, yes, I would. He requested that we have counsel. And at the time we said, what do we need lawyers for? He said, well, I think it's prudent. So what do we need 2 lawyers for heaven's sakes? Mm-hmm. He said, well, that's the way the system works is each person has to be represented by their own attorney. And what Mike saw became painfully and publicly clear.
So let's say there are 2 scenarios. The one scenario is there's an intruder and a kidnapper who writes a ransom note. And you could then have the Ramseys are innocent and they don't know that they need legal representation. Another scenario is that someone in the house wrote the ransom note and they know that. And do you still think that they wouldn't know that they might need a lawyer, given that was there a kidnapper? Certainly on the 26th, did it seem to the police that there was a kidnapper? Now, in the decade or more that I've spent in true crime, I can't think of anyone who lawyered up more than the Ramseys. John had a lawyer, Patsy had her own lawyer, a different lawyer, Burke Ramsey had his own lawyer, John's first wife got a lawyer, and John's other kids got lawyers too. That's a whole lot of lawyers and a whole lot of lawyering. John also wasted very little time in setting up Team Ramsey, a powerhouse not only of some of the state's most powerful lawyers, but also big shots like John Douglas and Pat Corton, a PR dude from Washington, D.C., who was an expert on crisis management. Corton's company was Rowan and Blewett Incorporated. And all of that assembly led to articles like this one, as early as January 18th, 1997, in the Daily Camera. Ramseys hire only the best. And this is a quote from the article. When John and Patsy Ramsey appeared on national television New Year's Day, John Ramsey announced he wanted to hire the best minds this country has to offer to find his daughter's killer. Since then, the family has fulfilled that promise, assembling a team of lawyers, investigators, a former FBI agent, a media consultant, and even a handwriting expert. What was the mission? What was this dream team meant to do? Was it meant to catch the killer or get the Ramseys off the hook? Because if the mission was the former, if the mission was to catch the killer, it failed. And 28 years later, it's still a failure. If the dream team's mission was the latter, to get the Ramseys off the hook, well, hasn't it succeeded? In 1997, 1998, 1999, 2000, when they gave this interview, and through to the present. And now on to number 3. I don't need lawyers. I don't need PR. Those were Larry's words. Patsy says, we didn't have PR. We didn't have PR people, and then laughs. Well, did the Ramseys have PR or didn't they? Did they do PR or didn't they?
I didn't do it.
Just didn't do it.
That's what we said.
I don't need lawyers. I don't need PR. I don't need nothing. I didn't do it.
Let me clarify
didn't
one
have
other thing.
PR
We didn't have a PR.
No, you never did. Oh,
No.
That was a...
That was a myth.
Our attorney...
They didn't have PR people, and that was a myth. I mean, the ironic thing is they are on Larry King. What are they doing on Larry King right here? They're doing PR for their book, which is meant to be PR for their reputations. And what are they doing? They're saying they didn't do PR. I mean, look at this article from Vanity Fair. It's dated 1st of October 1997. Within a week of the murder, a media consultant named Pat Corton was also brought aboard, later to be replaced by Rachel Zimmer, and so on and so on. Pat Corton actually gave an interview where he said that he advised the Ramseys against going on CNN. That means he was on the scene before the 1st of January, which would make it less than a week after the incident. And that comes up at 3102 in the 2016 Dateline documentary, Who Killed JONBENET Ramsey? Let's listen in.
We want the best minds this country has to offer to help us resolve this. This doesn't come from anger. It comes from knowing that the only way that my family could move on now is to resolve why, who this happened.
Do you truly think the perpetrator will be found?
Yes.
I do find it interesting on that question. You know, do you genuinely feel that the perpetrator is going to be found? He gives this long shutting off blink. And think about the reality. Has that happened? And if someone had to ask you that question now, right, with the benefit of 28 years of hindsight, if someone had to ask you, do you think the perpetrator is going to be found in the Ramsey case, what would you say? What has happened?
Yes. Has to be found.
I looked at the television set and I thought, wait a minute, those are my clients. Why are they on television?
Pat Corton worked in the news business, then in public relations. The Ramseys had already hired attorneys to deal with police, and the attorneys in turn hired Corton to deal with the media. but Corton says he was not yet in the loop.
Now, it's interesting the word games that are sort of used. Maybe you don't want to call Pat Corton a PR person, but we all know what you're talking about here. But it's interesting the word games. Also, we didn't hire him, our lawyers did. Oh, okay, so that's, again, word games. And again, one's got to ask, isn't the ransom note word games?
If they had checked with you, you would have said, don't do that.
Don't even think about it. Don't even think about it.
So again, just think of those words. We didn't hire a PR person, and then our attorneys hired a media information person. Oh, well, okay, so that settles that then.
I didn't do it.
Let me clarify one other thing. We didn't have a PR
No, you never did. Okay.
No.
That was a
myth.
Our attorneys hired a media information person. They were.
Number 4, you did that one interview with CNN. Should you have done more? Now, what do you think the answer is to that question? What do you think the answer is? Because the Ramseys don't really answer it. The question is, you did that one interview with CNN. Should you have done more? And I would say the challenge, right, is to control the narrative, not feed it or inflame it. Right, so, if you had to ask me what I think the strategy was, right, should they have done more interviews? That's not really addressing the question. The challenge was to control the narrative, and you to do that, you don't feed the narrative or inflame the narrative or inform the narrative. What you try and do is, as I say, control the narrative. And of course, them coming onto CNN here now in March 2000, that was an attempt to control the narrative. They're there to publicize their book, which is to set the record straight or to set the record out in the way that they want it set out. And of course, this entire interview is an attempt to certainly address the narrative. Now, it's interesting, though, how Patsy responds to the question, saying they should never have moved to Boulder.
with CNN and then stopped doing them. Was that a mistake? Should you have done more? Or was it a mistake to do the CNN one?
Hindsight's 20/20.
What is your hindsight?
My hindsight is I never should have moved to Boulder, Colorado. I mean, if you're going to go back.
Again, it does make one wonder what Patsy's thinking. Could the move to Boulder have changed the dynamic in some way that could have warded off the crime from taking place to begin with? Were there people there the Ramseys wished they'd never met? Number 5, how do you react when people say you weren't angry enough? That's Larry's question, and he's referring obviously to JONBENET's death. Now, we'll review John's response on Larry King, but first let's look at John's response in The Killing of JONBENET, Her Father Speaks, and this is at about an hour, 19 minutes or so, where John talks about what makes him mad about the whole thing that he's been embroiled in, right?
We had people that came to our door, banging on the door, claiming they were CBS Entertainment people, and they've been up trying to find Burke. It makes me mad. This is not entertainment. This is my child that was murdered. She was a wonderful, innocent child that was murdered. The killer is still out there. This is not for entertainment.
Now, although John speaks with intensity, there isn't really a sense from his demeanor of anger. Or am I wrong about that? If anything, he seems to be amused. Am I wrong about that? Anyway, let's go back to Larry's question, which he seems to ask with an almost weary sigh.
How'd you react, John, when people said you weren't mad enough? You didn't appear angry, hurt, really whacked. I mean, you lost this beautiful little girl. You'd lost a daughter before in your life. I mean, we all look at it from our own perspective. You're a different personality. Well, I would be berserk.
Larry, inside I was berserk. I was crushed. I didn't want to live. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think.
And if you play that part again where he says, I couldn't breathe, he glances to the right, apparently for inspiration, and he says, I couldn't think. And yet Linda Arndt describes a different John, talking about at Ground Zero on December 26th, the day after Christmas. She describes a cordial John, but also a John she didn't once observe interacting with Patsy. He says, I was crushed. I didn't want to live. Inside, I was going berserk. Well, wouldn't a husband and a father be, in a way, interacting with Patsy, kind of in that sense? I mean, even just in the sense of giving consolation to Patsy or to seek it. Anyway, the report reads, John Ramsey paced between the area of the den and the formal dining room. John was usually by himself. I did not see John or Patsy interact with each other. No one in the house made any obvious comment to me that it was after 1000 hours, okay. Anyway, then we know that John says, Larry, inside I was berserk, I was crushed. But the important part that he says there, for me, is he says, I couldn't think. Now, if the window wasn't used by an intruder, if it was staged, was that by someone paralyzed with fear who couldn't think? The 3-page ransom note, if that wasn't something from an intruder, that suggests possibly a thinking perpetrator, or a perpetrator that is clearly able to think on their feet, I guess. Arndt's report continues, when I talked briefly with John Ramsey during the morning of December 26, he was able to carry on a conversation and articulate his words. John Ramsey had smiled, joked, and seemed to focus during the conversation. Patsy seemed to be much less focused when I spoke with her. Now, in the last 2 minutes of the killing of JONBENET, The Truth Uncovered, John Ramsey explains in his own words why he's still fighting. And again, with a slight smile on his face, he says the following.
Just the other day, my 9-year-old granddaughter saw a tabloid in the supermarket that had an accusation against her grandfather, and it confused her. It hurt her. That's horrible. And that's what I'm fighting. For her, I don't want her to wonder about her grandfather or be ashamed of me or our family name.
So that is John giving the reason for why he's doing this. Do you think that's the real reason? A lot of people have asked me, why is John Ramsey still such a public figure in terms of this case? Do you think that's the answer? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.